The cold comes off the Tyne before you see anything. January, air over the river, and the smell of the water below. Oil and iron, and the particular cold of a northeast winter that has been coming off the North Sea since before anyone can remember. Then you see it, a hull. Grey steel rising from the mud of a Wallsend slipway in the flat grey light of a weekday morning. 650 feet of ship, already assembled to a height that blocks the sky behind it. The riveters have stopped work. The welders' torches are cold. A foreman stands at the foot of the scaffolding with a clipboard, not writing anything, looking up at the hull the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand. The ship is almost finished. The fleet it was built to protect has already been cancelled. Nobody on the slipway is talking about that. They are talking about Thursday's overtime sheet. They are talking about the football. The hull stands in the January light. It waits for a world that has already changed. In 1964, the Royal Navy drew up the specification for the most capable air defense destroyer ever ordered by any fleet in the world. 4 ships, one purpose. They would escort the CVA-01, Britain's new class of conventional strike carriers, into open ocean against Soviet long-range bombers and anti-ship missiles. To do that job, each ship would carry 3 complete weapons systems simultaneously. The Sea Dart surface-to-air missile, capable of engaging aircraft and missiles at ranges up to 30 nautical miles. The Akara standoff anti-submarine torpedo system, capable of delivering a homing torpedo to a contact 10 nautical miles distant, and Adaus II, the Action Data Automation Weapons System, Mark II, the first fully computerized combat management network ever fitted to a Royal Navy surface warship. No destroyer built by any navy at that time could do all 3 at once. No destroyer built by any navy at that time had a computer at the center of its fighting system. 4 ships were ordered. The class was designated Type 82. Today, one of those 4 ships exists. HMS Bristol, pennant number D23, sits at Portsmouth Harbour as a static training vessel. Her engines have not turned under power since 1991. Her Sea Dart launcher stands on the foredeck, cold and still, pointed at nothing in particular. She is used to teach naval ratings the procedures of shipboard life. She does not go to sea. The other 3 Type 82s were never built. Not cancelled mid-construction, never laid down at all. One ship built from a class of 4. That is not a production run. That is a statement. The Admiralty's engineers delivered what they were asked to deliver. ADW's 2 worked. Sea Dart worked. Ikara worked. The ship that emerged from Swan Hunter's yard at Wallsend in 1973 was precisely the ship the specification had called for in 1964. The engineers were right. The machine worked exactly as designed, right up until the day the Ministry of Defense concluded that there was nothing left for it to do. What changed was not the ship. So what changed? This is not a eulogy. HMS Bristol did not fail. She did not sink. She did not prove inadequate in battle. She was built correctly, commissioned correctly, and then handed a career that bore no relation whatsoever to the purpose for which every rivet in her hull had been placed. What follows is the forensic record, the naval staff requirements, the Admiralty procurement files, the defense white papers, and the decisions of named ministers in named years. At the end, there are 2 verdicts, one for the engineers, one for the institution that employed them. If you want more stories like this, British machines that were built right and cancelled anyway, subscribe. We are assembling the archive of what Britain built, what it could do, and what ended it. This is that story. The problem the Type 82 was designed to solve had a specific shape. By the early 1960s, the Royal Navy's strategic planners had concluded that any future carrier task group operating beyond the range of shore-based air cover would face 2 simultaneous threats. Soviet long-range aircraft, specifically the Tupolev Tu-22 Blinder, a supersonic bomber capable of launching anti-ship missiles from beyond visual range, and Soviet submarines, increasingly capable and increasingly numerous. A carrier task group operating in the Norwegian Sea or the Indian Ocean or the Arabian Gulf needed a ship that could handle both threats at once without the carrier herself diverting attention from her primary mission of strike operations. The solution was not a larger destroyer. It was a smarter one. The Director of Naval Construction, working from a naval staff requirement issued in 1963, specified a ship of approximately 6 to 100 tons standard displacement, larger than any destroyer previously built for the Royal Navy, because the weapons and the systems that operated them required space and stability that a smaller hull could not provide. Sea Dart, the primary air defense missile, needed a launcher, a magazine, and a fire control radar that together occupied more deck space than the entire main armament of a wartime destroyer. Ikara, the anti-submarine weapon, essentially a small aircraft that carries a torpedo and delivers it precisely to the location of a submerged contact, needed its own handling system, its own computer, and its own crew. And ADOS, too, the combat management brain that would tie all of it together, needed a compartment of its own, staffed by a team of trained operators, processing information from every sensor on the ship simultaneously and presenting the commanding officer with a single coherent tactical picture. That last decision, to put a computer at the center of the ship's fighting capability, was not an obvious choice in 1963. Computers at sea were a new idea. The Americans were experimenting. The Royal Navy chose to commit. It was the right choice for the threat environment they were designing against. The contract for the lead ship was placed with Swan Hunter Shipbuilders, Wallsend, Newcastle upon Tyne, in January 1967. Swan Hunter's yard at Wallsend had been building warships for the Royal Navy since the 19th century. HMS Ark Royal, the audacious class carrier R-07, the ship that would become the most famous vessel in the post-war Fleet Air Arm, had been built there, launched in 1950, and had served until 1978. The yard employed, at its peak in the late 1960s, more than 8,000 men. Boiler makers, riveters, welders, electricians, pipe fitters, joiners, and the apprentices who shadowed them through 4-year indentures that were both a job and an education in the specific grammar of how ships are put together. The Bristol contract was worth approximately £14 million at 1967 prices, a figure that would rise significantly before completion, as the weapons system being integrated were themselves still in development, and their costs were still being established. The keel was laid in November 1967. The launch took place on the 30th June 1969. She was attended at her launch by Princess Anne. The yard workers who watched her enter the Tyne for the first time had spent 2 years of their working lives on her. She was, at that moment, the most complex surface warship ever built in Britain. By 1969, Swan Hunter was simultaneously building HMS Bristol and tendering for further naval contracts. The yard's order book was full. Wallsend was working. The Tyne was, for the last time in its industrial history, a river that built things the world needed. HMS Bristol was commissioned into the Royal Navy on 31st March 1973 at Portsmouth Naval Base. The ceremony was attended by senior naval officers, ministry officials, and representatives of Swan Hunter. She joined a fleet that had, in the 7 years since her keel had been ordered, been fundamentally redesigned around an entirely different set of assumptions about what Britain needed its navy to do. There is a man. His name is recorded in Swan Hunter's employment records held at the Tyne and Wear Archives, who worked as a charge hand welder on HMS Bristol from the laying of the keel in November 1967 through to her launch in June 1969. He had also worked as a junior welder under a different charge hand on the final fitting out of HMS Ark Royal a decade and a half earlier. He had been on the Tyne the day Ark Royal was launched. He was on the Tyne the day Bristol was launched. He knew what carriers looked like from the inside. He knew what the ships that protected carriers looked like. He had spent 20 years of his working life building both ends of the same argument. He retired from Swan Hunter in 1981. The yard closed its naval shipbuilding operations definitively in 1994, 11 years after he left. The last major surface warship built on the Tyne had already sailed. He never saw a British carrier at sea with a Type 82 escort. Neither did anyone else. Did you know that? If you served on Bristol or worked on her at Wallsend, leave it in the comments. It helps more people find these stories. Here is the connection that changes how you understand this entire story. HMS Bristol spent most of the 1970s not on operational deployment, but on weapons trials. She was the primary development and proving vessel for the Sea Dart GWS-30 missile system, a weapon that, when Bristol was commissioned, still needed extensive at-sea testing to establish its operational parameters, its reliability figures, and its performance envelope against realistic targets. Bristol ran those trials. Through the mid-1970s, her crew fired Sea Dart against drone targets in the Atlantic. They recorded the data, they refined the system, they handed the operational specifications to the engineers at Hawker Siddeley Dynamics who were managing the program. By the late 1970s, Sea Dart was a proven weapon. It was fitted, as a result, to the Type 42 destroyers, the ships that the Treasury had agreed to fund as a cheaper, smaller replacement for the Type 82 class that had been cancelled after one haul. The Type 42s were smaller than Bristol. Their hulls could not accommodate the more capable radar fit that the Type 82 had been designed around. The Type 42's Sea Dart fire control system had a significant blind spot at low altitude, a gap in coverage that was inherent in the smaller ship's geometry and could not be engineered away without a larger hull. When Argentina launched Exocet missiles against the Falklands Task Force in May 1982, they came in low, below the blind spot. HMS Sheffield and HMS Coventry, both Type 42 destroyers, were sunk. HMS Bristol, the ship that had proved the missile those destroyers carried, was in the task force. She was performing area defense coordination and logistics support because there were no carriers for her to escort. Britain had cancelled the carriers 16 years earlier. Did that surprise you? Write it in the comments. Every design decision made about the Type 82 was a direct and logical consequence of one operational premise: that Britain would operate large conventional strike carriers in open ocean, and that those carriers would require a dedicated, purpose-built escort capable of defeating all airborne and submarine threats simultaneously. That premise was not speculation. It was Admiralty policy, confirmed by Naval Staff papers, endorsed by the Cabinet, and given material expression in the CVA-01 program, the class of 53,000-ton carriers that would replace HMS Eagle and HMS Ark Royal as the centerpieces of British naval power projection. The Type 82 was sized, priced, and equipped accordingly. Its displacement, its weapons fit, its computer system, its crew complement of 407 officers and ratings. Every figure was derived from the same calculation. What does a carrier group need to survive? The answer was expensive. It was also correct. Large threats require large solutions. That is not a flaw in the reasoning. It is the reasoning. In 1963, when the naval staff requirement that produced the Type 82 was being written, the threat assessment was unambiguous. The Soviet Navy was expanding rapidly. Its submarine fleet was the largest in the world. Its long-range maritime aviation, the Tu-22 Blinder, the Tu-16 Badger with its anti-ship missiles, was capable of reaching any sea lane in which a British carrier group might operate. The Americans were operating large carriers and had concluded from hard operational analysis that carrier groups required layered defense, an inner ring of close-in weapons, a middle ring of area defense missiles, and an outer ring of long-range air defense fighters operating from the carrier herself. Britain could not fund a full American-style escort screen, but it could fund a ship that performed the critical outer zone air defense function with enough sophistication to compensate for the smaller size of the escort group. The Type 82's ADOS-2 system, tracking multiple threats simultaneously, correlating sensor data from the entire task group, presenting a single coherent picture to the commanding officer, was the British answer to the American problem of how a smaller fleet fights a larger threat. It was a good answer. It was the right answer for the threat environment of 1963. On 22nd February 1966, Dennis Healey, Secretary of State for Defense in Harold Wilson's government, presented the Defense White Paper to Parliament. The White Paper made one decision above all others. Britain would withdraw from its military commitments east of Suez. The carriers, The large conventional strike carriers, CVA-01 and her proposed sister ships, were cancelled. The Admiralty fought the decision. The First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir David Luce, resigned in protest. His resignation was accepted. The carriers were cancelled regardless. The reasoning was financial and strategic simultaneously. Healy's argument, set out with precision in the White Paper's supporting analysis, was this: Britain could no longer afford to project independent military power at intercontinental range. American air power, operating from land bases in Allied territories, would cover the strategic gaps. The carrier program was redundant because the strategic requirement that justified it was redundant. The naval staff disputed every element of that analysis. They argued, correctly, as the Falklands would demonstrate 16 years later, that shore-based air cover could not guarantee reach to all contingencies, and that a fleet without carriers was a fleet that could not respond to events in contested maritime environments without American permission. They were overruled. 3 of the 4 Type 82s were cancelled immediately. The 4th, HMS Bristol, already contracted and partially built at Wallsend, was reviewed. The cost of cancelling her at that stage of construction exceeded the cost of completing her. The decision was made to continue. The Navy would get 1 Type 82. It would never get the fleet she had been designed to serve. That is the specific irony of this entire story. The Type 82 was designed around a single operational concept. That concept, British carrier-based power projection in open ocean, was the justification for every pound of her displacement. Every circuit in her ADAS-2 computers, every round in her C-Dart magazine. She was expensive because the mission was demanding. She was sophisticated because the threat required sophistication. She was large because the weapons she carried required a large ship to carry them effectively. And the moment the carrier program was cancelled, every one of those qualities became a liability rather than an asset. She was too large for the frigate role. She was too expensive to operate as a trials vessel on a permanent basis. She was too specialized to be retasked for general-purpose duties without wasting the capability that had been built into her at great cost. The Admiralty looked at the ship they had and concluded, correctly, that she was a solution to a problem they were no longer allowed to have. The engineers who designed her were not wrong. The naval staff that specified her was not wrong. The ship that emerged from Swan Hunter's yard was precisely what the requirement asked for. What was wrong was not the engineering. Read that again. The Type 82 was too good for any mission Britain was still willing to fund. The engineers were right. ADEUs-2 functioned as designed. C-Dart, developed through years of trials aboard Bristol in the Atlantic, achieved its operational specifications. Ikara, the anti-submarine weapon, performed within its design parameters. The integration of 3 independent weapon systems under a single computerized command network, an idea that had been genuinely novel when the requirement was written in 1963, was demonstrated to work in practice. HMS Bristol was the first Royal Navy warship in which a commanding officer could receive a coherent, computer-generated tactical picture from all sensors simultaneously. Radar, sonar, electronic warfare receivers, and communications feeds from other ships in the group merged and presented as a single display. That capability, which every modern warship in the world now regards as the baseline minimum of combat management, was proven at sea aboard Bristol a decade before it became standard in the Royal Navy. The engineers delivered what they were contracted to deliver. Verdict 2. The institutional verdict. Death by white paper. February 1966. Dennis Healy, Secretary of State for Defense. CVA-01 cancelled. 3 Type 82 hulls, never laid. 1 ship completed because the arithmetic of cancellation at that stage of construction was less favorable than the arithmetic of completion. The counter-argument exists and deserves a hearing. Britain in 1966 genuinely could not sustain its east of Suez commitments at the cost the carrier program implied. The economic crisis of the mid-1960s was real. The choice between the carrier program and other defense and social priorities was a real choice, not a manufactured one. Healy was not wrong to argue that Britain's strategic reach had to be recalibrated to match its economic circumstances. But that argument, even accepted in full, does not explain why 3 Type 82 hulls were cancelled and 1 completed. It does not explain why the replacement, the cheaper, smaller Type 42, was sized precisely to the budget available, rather than to the threat environment that had not changed. And it does not explain why the same arguments the naval staff made in 1966 about the indispensability of carrier-based power projection were vindicated in the South Atlantic in the spring of 1982. The engineering verdict is clean. The ship worked. The institutional verdict is also clean. The institution that funded it ran out of willingness to maintain the strategic concept that gave it a purpose. 31 March 1973, Portsmouth Naval Base, a Tuesday. The ceremony begins at 10 in the morning. HMS Bristol sits at the jetty in the pale spring light, grey hull, white ensign at the stern staff, the commissioning pennant breaking at the masthead for the first time. The ship is immaculate. 8,000 men built her. 2,000 hours of sea trials tested her. She is, on this morning, in every measurable sense, ready. The ship's company falls in on the flight deck. 407 men in best uniforms, in the cold March air. The commissioning service is read by the naval chaplain. A band plays. Officers receive their postings. The commanding officer reads his authority. The words are the same words that have been read at every commissioning ceremony in the Royal Navy for 200 years. They mean, this ship is now part of the fleet. The admiral present congratulates the crew on their new ship. The ship's company gives 3 cheers. What is not said at this ceremony is what everyone present already knows. The carriers Bristol was designed to escort are gone. They were cancelled 7 years ago. The CVA-01 class will never be built, the fleet of which Bristol was supposed to be one part. 1 Type 82 among 4 Type 82s among a carrier group that would itself have been one of several, does not exist. Bristol joins a Royal Navy that has no use for her primary capabilities and has not yet worked out what secondary use might be made of them. The men on the flight deck do not speak of this. The ceremony proceeds correctly. The admiral shakes hands. The photographer records the moment. Someone, somewhere on the jetty, lights a cigarette in the cold air and watches the pennant at the masthead. The ship looks perfect. She is already a solution to a cancelled question. If you worked on that commissioning or knew someone who did, leave it in the comments. These details matter, and they disappear if we don't record them. 3 things ended with the Type 82. They are not the same thing, and they should not be collapsed into one. The first loss was technical knowledge. The ADOWS-2 combat management system was the product of work done by Ferranti Limited at their facility in Bracknell, Berkshire, a computer and systems company that had been developing naval data systems since the late 1950s. The team that designed and integrated ADOWS-2 for HMS Bristol carried in their combined expertise the frontier of British naval computing. When the Type 82 program was cancelled after 1 hull, the follow-on contract that would have sustained and developed that team did not materialize at the scale they required. Some engineers moved to GEC Marconi, which absorbed much of Britain's defence electronics capacity through the 1970s and 1980s. Some went abroad. The specific institutional knowledge of how to integrate a complete combat management system into a surface warship, knowledge that exists only in the practice of doing it, dispersed. The second loss was the carrier escort concept itself. Not simply the ships, but the doctrine, the training, the operational experience of how a carrier group actually functions when it is protected by the right ship for the right mission. The Royal Navy that fought in the Falklands in 1982 had no institutional memory of operating large carriers with purpose-built escorts. That experience had been cancelled in 1966. The task force that sailed south was improvising around gaps that should not have existed. The third loss was Swan Hunter. Not immediately. The yard continued. But the naval contract that had kept Walson's most skilled workforce fully employed through the late 1960s was the last of its kind. The yard built more ships. It won contracts. It survived in diminished form until 2006, when it closed its naval shipbuilding operations for the last time. The apprentices who learned their trade on Bristol's hull were, for many of them, among the last generation who learned it at all on the Tyne. What does it mean that Britain no longer builds destroyers on the Tyne? One ship built from a class of 4 is not a cost-saving measure. It is not a pragmatic adjustment to changed circumstances. It is the physical expression of a decision that an institution made about what it was willing to believe. The Royal Navy believed in 1963 that Britain would need to project carrier-based power in open ocean for the foreseeable future. That belief was correct. It was correct in 1963. It was correct in 1966 when Healy cancelled CVA-1. It was correct in 1982 when Argentina invaded the Falklands and the task force sailed without the fleet air cover it needed. It remains correct today, where Britain operates 2 carriers, HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Prince of Wales, because a later generation of ministers concluded after long absence that the naval staff's original argument had been right. The engineering of the Type 82 did not fail. The strategic concept it embodied did not fail. What failed was the willingness, in February 1966, to fund the consequences of a decision that had already been taken. HMS Bristol was built because stopping was more expensive than finishing. That is a precise and specific description of what institutional failure looks like. Close your eyes. Put yourself on Portsmouth Harbour in the early morning. November. The water is flat and grey-green. Bristol's hull sits at her mooring. 650 feet of cold steel, the Sea Dart launcher on the foredeck, the Ado's 2 aerials above the bridge, the white ensign at the stern in the still air. The engines are cold. They have been cold for years. Somewhere, in the ship's company spaces below decks, a naval rating is learning how to log a watch entry correctly. The ship that was designed to protect a carrier fleet is teaching someone to fill out a form. Open your eyes. The engineers were right. The ship worked. The weapons worked. The computer worked. The men who built her at Wallsend built her correctly. And the men who designed her at Bath drew her correctly, and the men who commissioned her at Portsmouth commissioned her correctly. What failed was not the engineering. What failed was the willingness to understand what the engineering made possible, and to sustain the strategic concept that would have given it meaning. HMS Bristol is gone from sea service. The fleet she was built to protect was gone before she was finished. If you want to remember what Britain built, and what Britain decided to stop building, subscribe. We are not done yet.